Hello, everyone. On behalf of McGriff Risk Solutions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us today as we kick off our 2020 webinar educational series. Today, we're going to discuss cybersecurity and making sense of compliance regulatory suit. My name is Lasagna Wilder, and I will be your host for the call today. Before we jump into this very timely topic, there are just a couple of housekeeping points that I would like to share with you. In an effort to eliminate distractions and any unwanted noises, the phone lines will remain muted throughout the presentation, and that's due to the volume of participants we have on the call today. Although your lines are muted, you will be able to communicate with us via the chat box and the Q&A box. We will be monitoring those boxes throughout the presentation, so feel free to send any questions that you have, and we will get to those questions. Now to our speaker. It brings me great pleasure to introduce to you Tom McKenzie, Vice President, Privacy and Security Compliance at TCDI. In this senior leadership role, he is responsible for privacy and data security compliance efforts and serves as TCDI's Data Protection Officer. As part of his client-facing responsibilities, Tom is the liaison for clients and prospective clients interested in TCDI's controls and approaches to data privacy and security. He also consults with clients on an array of data protection topics, including policy development, privacy and security planning, and employee training. Additionally, Tom aids TCDI's product planning and product development teams as they implement privacy and security by design approaches in product development. He has spent 25 years with the top 10 pharmaceutical company. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Colorado with educational focus in behavioral development and business. Tom is a black belt trained in Lean Six Sigma and holds multiple information privacy certifications such as CIPP-US, CIPP-E, CIPM from the IAPP, recognized as the global industry standard for professionals in the field of privacy. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tom McKenzie.
Well, thank you, Lasagna. I appreciate that. I appreciate that very generous introduction there. And thank you all for joining today. I'm really pleased to be able to talk with you. I think you could tell by that introduction that my role at TCDI intersects with a lot of privacy policies and processes and security policies and controls and really all of the compliance activity that surrounds all of that stuff. I know when I was asked to do this webinar, I felt like there was an awful lot to unpack when it started to get into things like the regulatory soup. I love that phrase, by the way, but one of the things I do want to let you know is what we aren't going to do today is we're not going to dissect all the various regulations that are going on in the U.S. and around the world, really. We certainly wouldn't have time to do that, number one. And number two, most of these regulations aren't going to apply to you. You know, the type of model that we have in the U.S., if you fall under a regulation, you fall under it very strictly. If you don't, you don't. And so, you know, you could almost do one webinar per regulation if you chose to. Instead, what I think what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and gain some perspective on the environment. You know, how we got to where we're in the U.S. and how we can best move forward without being paralyzed by all the regulations and all the standards and security requirements that we're seemingly held to. And I'm going to hopefully try and help begin to help you map out kind of a direction of how you can proceed or how your organizations can proceed to stay ahead of all this stuff. So let's kind of jump in and talk a little bit about data security and where it's derived from, because there are several different areas where data security comes from, or what's driving data security. The first one is just markets. The markets, in fact, can be a real useful driver of security. When consumers raise concerns or make demands about security, companies typically respond. So that's the market-driven aspect of it. Technology can be a very, very important aspect driving security. New advances provide new ways of protecting information, and that leads to the enhancement and adoption of best practices. So best practices are moving forward all the time, and a lot of these best practices from a technical standpoint begin to become standard in some of the things we buy and the things we do. So technology plays a huge role in it. The laws or the regulations, the regulatory soup, is a huge aspect of it as well. The laws are often looked at as a traditional approach to driving data privacy and security, but enacting a law doesn't really guarantee better privacy and security. That's the first point. The second point is not all laws are even all that well drafted, and not all laws are equally enforced. So it's, you have those issues associated with it. You also have self-regulation that comes into play as a driver for security. Self-regulation is really a complement to the laws, but it isn't really codified in the laws. The greatest example that we have of that in the U.S. is the PCS-DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. That is probably the best example I could give you worldwide of a self-regulatory type of driver of security. And you may even have your own published security standards within your company, so those become a driver of security as well. So, having said that, let's kind of get into where we find ourselves in the U.S. And maybe before we start to talk really about the U.S. model, we can talk about a comprehensive model. The U.S. model is really a sectoral model. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Elsewhere in the world, they use a comprehensive model. And I'm bringing this up because in the U.S., I think we're moving toward a more comprehensive model. But in the European Union, for instance, with GDPR, that's considered a comprehensive model for privacy and security. And I'll oftentimes use those terms, privacy and security, synonymous, although they are not synonymous terms. They are different, but they do relate to each other, and there is a great deal of overlap between privacy and security. So all of the privacy laws that we see being put in place do have a component of security that is a part of those laws, whether it's really specifically stated or not. But if we look at a comprehensive model, the pros of a comprehensive model is that you've got one overarching set of rules that is guiding both the public and private sectors when it comes to privacy and security. And this could be on a state-by-state basis, or in the case of the EU, it's country by country. Certainly a pro of a comprehensive model is the ease. It's easier and more cost-effective, less complex for a business and their compliance efforts associated with the rules. and it enhances consumer confidence a lot of times because consumers tend to have a better understanding and knowledge of a comprehensive model because there's really only one set of rules. The cons, or the downside of a comprehensive model, there's a couple of them. First of all, one size doesn't fit all. If you are in an industry where the security requirements need to be very strict because of the type of data that you manage, then the onerous types of restrictions are appropriate. But if you're not in that type of an industry, then a one-size-fits-all may be a little bit too onerous for an organization or a sector of business. Another con is data security requirements are often not sufficiently detailed in these things. But there's a reason for that, and we'll talk in just a second about that. Now, the U.S. model being a sectoral model, what that means is the protection of personal information is achieved by enacting laws that address particular industries or sectors. For example, if you're in the banking industry, you're regulated by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act or GLBA. If you're in the healthcare industry, you know that you are regulated by HIPAA. If you are in an education institution, you know that you're regulated by FERPA or the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And there are others. The list really goes on. This soup is quite thick, but there are pros and cons of a sectoral model as well. First of all, the pros are the regulations tend to match the security requirements of the regulation to the sensitivity of the information that's being managed in the sector. It also can provide cost savings to those companies not in a given sector, and as such not needing as strict of controls. The cons is some confusion. There's no single authority for enforcement. There may be gaps and overlaps in the requirements, and still the data security requirements oftentimes are really just not made very clear. So what do you do about that? Well, there is some guidance given from a data security standpoint in this regulatory soup. Our sectoral model, good or bad, is what we currently enjoy, but the law often contains words like you have to do what's reasonable. How many times have you read that in a law? Or you have to do what is appropriate to the size and complexity of the institution and the nature and scope of its activities. These types of statements tell you that there are things you need to be doing, but they don't really do a great job of telling you what it is you really need to be doing. And so, the lack of specifics can be troublesome. But the law really isn't oftentimes, they're not trying to get overly specific with things like security requirements. One thing they will get specific with is what's going to happen to you, or what are the consequences if you don't keep data safe. But oftentimes they're not as clear as you'd like them to be when it comes to what do I have to do to make data safe. And there's a reason for that. First of all, what we do to keep data safe changes all the time. Advances in technology we talked about, that changes all the time. The standards and the structures around what we're trying to keep safe changes all the time. So if you put in the laws, if you codify the actual requirements, the specific requirements, those things could become out of date very, very quickly. So that's why you see in these laws oftentimes the vague wording and the lack of specificity that you'd really like to have. So what do? Well, you start with figuring out what are we really trying to accomplish here. And there's a few different things we're trying to accomplish at a very high level. First is we want to do the right thing. We want to protect the sensitive information that we're entrusted with and that we manage. We also want to reduce our risk of the regulatory fines and penalties that come into place if we don't protect that information. And we want to reduce the risk of individuals' private right of action, or we want to reduce the risk of being sued. That's pretty clear. So at its highest level, those are the things that we're trying to accomplish. So how do you do that? Well, you look actually to standards and best practices. And if you start to read regulations, they're leading you to standards and best practices. The regulations typically will talk about different sections of standards and best practices, but they don't get real specific on what you should do within each of those sections. So the first place I would go is the regulations themselves. Read through the regulations. Some regulations give you a little more specificity than others, and some are really quite vague. But get what you can from the regulations in terms of guidance as to where you want to go. The second thing that I would do is look to establish and accepted published standards such as NIST. NIST publication 853, for instance, or ISO 27001. These are standards that are published that will give you a great deal of guidance in terms of what you can put in place. And in the case of ISO, there's also certification that you can gain if you choose to, although that is a fairly expensive certification. But for some industries, it's absolutely worth it, and so it's something to look into. The third place I would go is look to organizations that are publishing best practices or providing training resources and related certifications like the SANS Institute or the Center for Internet Security, CIS, or even the American Association of Certified Public Accountants, the AICPA, with their SOC 2 trust principles. These are all really good places to go to kind of look for what are the best practices that I should be considering for the organization. And then finally, you might even look to independent security audits that map to findings or map the questions and findings to the established regulations, standards, and best practices that we've talked about. Once you've done that, once you've gotten a sense for what are in these standards, what these best practices should be, you need to look within your company and you need to establish and document your best practices and controls. It's not enough just to say, I adhere to NIST or yeah, we follow ISO best practices. This is something that many of your customers are going to expect you to document specifically within your organization. And when you do that, you'll want to be looking at three areas: the technical controls, the administrative controls, and physical controls. All of your best practices can be kind of boiled down into one of those three areas. Let's go through those. And before we do, and I apologize, this is a real laundry list here. There's really no other way to do it. But let me first say that depending upon your organization, and again, your size, the complexity of your organization, your risk profile, the threats that really you guys are dealing with, you may or may not focus great attention to some of these, whether they be the technical controls, the organizational controls, or the physical controls. But we're going to go through them. I'll try and kind of give you a sense for which are the ones that are really must-haves and which are the ones that are nice to have if your organization can, one, afford them, or two, really need them. So that's what we'll try and do. So let's start with boundary defenses. Boundary defenses are things like your firewalls. In every company, if you've got internet-facing devices, internet-facing servers, you must have at least a firewall, and in some cases you'll have multiple firewalls. And you're going to want to make sure that these firewalls are configured correctly and that the configurations are checked quite frequently to be sure they're still in line with what needs to be put in place. Your firewalls are able to block traffic. It could be that you'll want to block traffic in a geolocation standpoint, or depending upon the way you use your network, you may be able to block traffic to just specific IP addresses. In most cases, a company that has the public coming in or customers coming in, you'll need to leave those open at least to the traffic, but you must have those firewalls in place. You may also augment firewalls with intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems, all of this to protect the flow of information moving across networks of really different trust levels. So that's what your boundary defenses are. Malware defenses. Your malware defenses are the antivirus protection that you have in place. You're going to want this in place both on your network and on user endpoints. User endpoints meaning your laptops, workstations, mobile devices, things like that. Where you can, you'll want to use URL and DNS filtering that will limit access to dangerous websites. You'll certainly want to block unnecessary file types from getting in. For instance, you can configure your email system so it doesn't allow executable files to come through. You may do some geo-blocking in your email system. I mean, if you're not doing business in North Korea, you probably don't need traffic from North Korea. And you'll want to have advanced malware protection if you can on your web gateways and your email gateways. The next one is active patch management. Active patch management is really a key part of ongoing vulnerability management, and it's keeping systems and software up to date with the latest protections against vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities can pop up daily. So it's something that you want your IT people to be taking very seriously. You want it documented, and you want the latest and greatest when it comes to patches on your systems and software. In talking about ongoing vulnerability management, you also need to be talking about ongoing vulnerability scanning and remediation of vulnerabilities that are found in your scans as well. It's a little bit different than patch management, but it's all a part of ongoing vulnerability management. You also have access and authentication controls. These include things like, well, they could include things like data encryption. They certainly would include things like network segmentation, firewalling between portions of your network or separating VLANs, the use of access control groups or lists so that you are limiting access to areas of your network and data on your network based on a principle of what is called least privilege. And the principle of least privilege is really quite simple. It says if you need access to those areas or that data to do your business, to do your everyday responsibilities, then you should have access to that. But that if you don't, then access just should not be given to you. The effort there is really to limit, if your account is compromised, it limits where the bad guy can go and what the bad guy can get to. So access and authentication controls are an important concept. The concept you've all heard, I'm sure, of two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication can be one of your best friends when it comes to authentication controls. And you want to use that certainly where it's appropriate. If you have remote access, you're remoting in from the outside of your company, two-factor authentication should be a must. Software configuration standards. This really pertains to hardware and software that has access to your servers, the workstations, the laptops, the mobile devices, things like that. There's a lot of default settings that these come with out of the box that are not going to be configured for the highest levels of security. These typically are configured for ease of use and ease of implementation and will need to be configured to help provide the greatest levels of security. You also want to make sure that you do have, well, I'll get to controlling that. The next one is control of administrative privileges. Administrative access is like the master keys to the kingdom. So you want to limit administrative types of access to those who really need it. And you want to maintain a real close inventory of those accounts. You certainly should use multi-factor authentication for administrative account access without question for remote access. And a best practice nowadays is really to use it for all access, even in the local area network access as well, because that type of access is so vulnerable and so susceptible, or puts your systems and environment at such risk if it gets compromised. You also want to limit use of these accounts to administrative duties. And what I mean by that is your administrators also are typically regular users on your network as well. So they've got an administrative account and they've got a regular user account. Their regular user account is what they should use for everyday on the network types of activities. They should not be logging into their higher credentialed accounts or their administrative accounts to do everyday activities. The reason for that is if by chance through everyday activity their accounts are compromised, the account that got compromised is now their administrative account. So you really want to save that administrative account for administrative duties only. So let's talk about wireless access and controls. You want to limit access to approved devices on wireless. You need to be monitoring for rogue wireless access points connected to a wired network. Let me give you an example that I saw one time. A guy came into the office, not here at TCDI, but at a client that I was working with, and he wanted to use his laptop, the wireless on his laptop, to connect to their network. And while he was in the office, so he could sit in a big easy chair he had in his office and do work. So he just brought in an access point that allowed him to hook it up to the port in the wall that was the access point to their network, and signed in through that access point using wireless. Well, that wireless access point is not under the company's control. The company didn't have any idea of what sort of security configuration had been done with it, and it really made itself a very vulnerable point for access for anybody who might have access to that wireless signal. So you really want to make sure that those access points are not connected to a wired network. You also want to use a segregated guest network for all non-authorized devices. All of this to reduce the exposure and unauthorized access to the network. Let's talk about account monitoring and control. You want to actively manage the life cycle of systems and application accounts so that attackers can't hide behind legitimate accounts. Now, in a small company, that's not easy to do. It's a little easier to see if you had an account for somebody that left the company and the account was still active in the system, even though that person wouldn't necessarily have access to it, but you didn't get rid of the account. You might see if that account was being used because it's a small company. Everybody knows everybody. But in a larger type of company, that could be a real issue. If you've got accounts that are dormant accounts, inactive accounts, or are accounts for people that have left the company and these are still active accounts, these become a real risk because if somebody were to gain access to those credentials or the ability to use those accounts, that could go unseen for an awful long time, and somebody could do great damage within your network or steal an awful lot of data through those types of accounts. So that account management monitoring and control is an important aspect. Asset management. Asset management is really talking about vulnerable hardware and software that might get onto your network. These could be things that are pieces of hardware that are not company managed, so that you are not able to make sure that the device has an appropriate level of malware control, or the antivirus signatures might not be up to date, or it could come onto your network already with some compromises or payloads of malware that could be easily delivered to your network if you are allowing that. So from an asset management standpoint, you want to make sure that you're not allowing assets onto the network that the company doesn't have direct control of. DLP controls, or data loss prevention controls. These are designed to prevent sometimes innocent, sometimes malicious exfiltration of important information or sensitive information. These controls could be things like, they certainly might be network-based through your email and your web security capabilities, or they could be endpoint-based through locking down the external drives and ports and keeping users from being able to upload things to removable media and walking out the door with them. So, depending upon the company and the type of data that you have, DLP controls can be a really important best practice for you. Data recovery capabilities are important certainly for most, if not every organization, and this pertains to the backups of key systems and information that you have. Backups should really be done automatic and they should be regular. Restoration of your backups should be tested regularly. Copies should be kept offline from your systems, and in some respects, some copies should probably also be kept off-site from a disaster recovery standpoint. The point about keeping your backup systems or backups offline is important now with the ransomware attacks that we're seeing. You don't want ransomware to be on your backups because your backups are what you're going to be trying to go to in most cases to recover from a ransomware attack. So if your backups are kept online, then the ransomware malware is going to have direct access to your backups just like it does any other part of your systems. So it's important that those backups be kept offline. And you want to be taking care to be sure that you've established through organizational needs what your recovery point objectives are and your recovery time objectives. And if you're not familiar with those two things, recovery point objectives, or RPOs, is the point at which you will recover to. So it's in essence saying we can afford to lose a certain amount of data and still be okay. That's our recovery point. It might be 24 hours, it might be 12 hours. You really determine that based on the needs of your company and how necessary it is that the data that you recover is up to date. Your recovery time objective is how long is it going to take you to recover. That's also determined by a business need. How long can you afford to be down? Some companies, it's not a big deal. A lot of their systems aren't mission critical, and therefore they really don't need short recovery time objectives. Other companies, if they're down for any time at all, they're out of business. So those things need to be determined and are part of your data recovery capabilities. And last but certainly not least is centralized continuous monitoring. This is a tough one for small companies because it requires typically some specialized equipment and certainly some specialized personnel to be able to analyze what is coming through. These usually involve a SIEM, a security event and information management system, which oftentimes can be expensive. There are third parties that you can work with that will do this, that you can work with and hire to do this continuous monitoring. But continuous monitoring and log monitoring is an important aspect of being able to identify attacks. A lot of times companies don't even know they've been attacked until long after the attack is over and the damage is well done. The key is really to try and see the attack at its earliest point so that corrective actions and blocking actions can be taken so that the attack doesn't become a successful attack. And you can really only do that if you've got some active, centralized, continuous monitoring going on in your environment. So I mentioned that's a laundry list, and man, it is. It's a big laundry list of technical controls. Again, not all companies need all aspects of each of these, but these are the things that you should be looking at and considering within the company, and you should be asking yourselves, is this something we need, and are we doing it? And if we are, to what extent are we doing these things? So let's switch gears now to administrative controls. Now, some of these can be a little bit softer, thank goodness, huh? So the first thing is policies, policy development and enforcement. Policies really form the backbone of any security program, and they're going to list those things that need to be going on in the company from a security standpoint. So all of your information security policies need to be developed and reviewed at least annually. I'm oftentimes asked, what are the policies that we need to have in place? And that is such a tough question to answer, because depending upon, again, the size and complexity of the company, it will dictate what sort of policies you need in place. At TCDI, we have a very complex environment. We manage very sensitive data for our clients for litigation and cybersecurity types of services. So we have a lot of policies, but I can throw out a handful here that are policies that you probably ought to consider. One is an acceptable use policy. An acceptable use policy is basically saying to your users, here's what you can and can't do on the network or on company-owned equipment. So it's painting the lines, it's giving the guidelines of what you can and can't do that will help keep the company safe. A password policy is absolutely critical. I'm surprised, even in this day and age, how lackadaisical companies can be with their password policies and change requirements and complexity requirements. Passwords are still one of your best ways to keep the bad guys out. They're not 100% foolproof, but they're still some of your best ways. And you should have a policy around passwords that deal with complexity and how often passwords need to be changed. You should have in that password policy, it should state sometimes what you think might not need to be stated, and that is you should never share your passwords with other people. You'd think you wouldn't have to say that, but it's amazing what goes on. An access control policy is one that you really should have. Access control policies are really telling, what are the rules of the road when it comes to gaining permission and access to restricted areas in the network or restricted data in the network. Not everybody should have access to everything. Your access control policy paints the picture of how that's going to be managed and how you're going to operate under that. You should have a risk management policy. In a lot of cases, the regulations the more strict regulations out there, those tell you specifically that you need a risk management policy and a risk management process. And this risk management policy sort of outlines how you go about assessing the threats that your organization is exposed to and the vulnerabilities that you have as an organization. It might get into an understanding of the mitigating controls that you have, but it will identify the gaps that need to be corrected to make sure you are moving forward as a safe organization. Mobile device policy. If you allow mobile devices, especially if you allow bring your own devices inside the company, you should have a mobile device policy that dictates how those things can be used. It also probably ought to dictate what sort of security controls need to be a part of that. And I would recommend that if you allow a bring your own device type of thing, that you require that device be a part of a mobile device management platform so that you can make sure that it has the security configuration that you need. A remote access. This is important if you have or you allow remote access into your network, then you should have a remote access policy that has all of the parameters around how that's going to work, including things like two-factor authentication, what devices can be used to do that if you're VPNing in to the network, and so on and so forth. You should also have a malware protection policy. This just states this is our standard when it comes to malware protection and what we're going to do to make sure that we maintain a safe environment as best we can from a malware standpoint. And you should have a patch management policy. This is important because patching is a real key component. We talked about it in the technical controls. It's a real key component of your overall vulnerability management. And if you don't have a policy dictating how you're going to do that, patch management can sometimes get a little sloppy. And when it does, that can lead to some real issues. And then you should probably also have a vulnerability management policy. And what that is going to state is how we're going to operate when it comes to things like scanning of our servers, both internally and externally, how we're going to manage the remediation of vulnerabilities. The critical vulnerabilities will need to be remediated within this period of time, sometimes hours. The high vulnerabilities within this period of time, medium vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. It should dictate how you're going to run all of that from a vulnerability management standpoint. So that's the policies that I recommend. Now, you should also have a new hire candidate check type of control in place. In some cases, that is dictated by regulations, but for most businesses, that's just a good practice. It's knowing who you're hiring and getting a good picture of these candidates that you're bringing on board and you're going to expose to, in some cases, very sensitive information. Security awareness and training is an area that is, again, sometimes dictated by the regulations. Security awareness and training of your employees is probably the most efficient dollars you'll ever spend. Most of the security incidents that occur because of human error or human carelessness. And if you don't train your people to be very security conscious, and if you don't develop a strong security culture within your company, that is going to be a weak link that will end up biting you. So you really want to take that one seriously, and it's an easy one to do. Best spent dollars you will ever make. I guarantee that to you. Let's talk about application software and security. Now, this one really only pertains if you are writing software internally or supporting a proprietary application somehow internally. It involves things like secure coding practices, training for the people that are doing this development, use of code analysis tools to look for coding vulnerabilities, and making sure that you are separating development and production environments. Probably doesn't pertain to a lot of companies out there, but I'm often surprised how many companies really are doing some sort of internal application software development. So this would be an important administrative control to have in place. Incident response and management is probably critical for everybody. These can be very significant and intricate documents, or they can be really simple. If you use a lot of third parties or a lot of cloud services, sometimes your incident response plan is relatively straightforward. But if you're managing a lot of this inside and you have your own internal IT infrastructure, incident response plans typically get a lot more complex. But there's something that really needs to be in place, and they need to be practiced because if you have an incident, you don't want to be just pulling out the plan for the first time. Things get really chaotic when you have a security incident, and so you want to have a plan that's been well practiced and understood by the participants. Independent penetration testing is important because the stuff you're going to do internally is sometimes subjective, and we tend to let ourselves off the hook a little bit, where an independent assessor might not. And penetration testing also takes a level of expertise where we're not only looking for vulnerabilities, we're looking to see if we can exploit vulnerabilities, which is really the key component there. So independent penetration testing probably should be done by most of you every year. Risk management processes, this is dictated by many of the regulations as well. I touched on it earlier. It is really just sort of the assessment of the threat environment and your vulnerabilities associated with that to be sure that you are shoring up through mitigation of areas of risk as best you can. Vendor management becomes more and more important with the more and more vendors you have. And I know that a lot of people are moving to third-party vendors. They're not doing a lot of this on their own, in their own IT infrastructures and whatnot. They're storing a lot of data with vendors. So your vendor management controls need to be real important. And then through all of this, internal audit is going to be key, and that is how you go about making sure that the things you say you're doing, you actually are doing. So those are your administrative controls. The physical controls are pretty straightforward. Facility access controls, if you can, you probably should be using some sort of electronic access control devices that are logging when people are certainly coming in, and in some of these systems when they're going out. You should look to have layered security zones, meaning that if you have a public lobby area where people walk in the front door, an unlocked front door, they're in a public zone, you should have locked doors beyond that where the work is being done. You may even have, once you're in that first layer of security, you may have secondary security zones, for instance, where your servers are located. Those should be in secure areas and should have restricted access. So layered security zones are important. You should have intrusion detection. That certainly it should be audible alarming, and it should be monitored by law enforcement. You might want to have motion detection as a part of that. Video surveillance is an important component. I know you have to balance video surveillance with privacy concerns, but you should have, if you're using video surveillance, you certainly should have video cameras pointing at all the doors. And if you've got real sensitive areas like server rooms, you would want them either pointing at the server room or in the server room. So video surveillance can be important. And then visitor logging and management is also important. Knowing who's coming and going and having a record of that. And once they're on your premises, making sure that they are accompanied when they're past that first security zone. And so those are the typical security controls. So we've really unpacked a lot here. We've gone through technical controls. We've gone through the organization or administrative controls, and we've gone through physical controls. I hope that at this point, the question you're asking yourself is, where are you at all of this? And what are the controls you have in place? And are there things you heard that you think maybe you ought to have in place, but that you don't? So that kind of brings us to the close of the content portion of this. I'm not sure if any questions have come in or if you have any questions, but if you do, I certainly am willing to entertain those.
Thank you, Tom, for that valuable information. We have had a question to come up, and it came up during the time when you was discussing the administrative controls, and it was, what about long passwords with no rotation?
Well, that's a great question, and NIST has changed their stance on passwords. NIST now is recommending that you do use long passwords, highly complex passwords, and if you're doing those right and you have some other controls in place, things like throttling or lockouts, that type of thing, that you probably don't have to change your passwords as often. And this is really a balance, because the more the more often you ask users to change passwords, the more likely they are to use easier passwords. Because let's face it, passwords are kind of the bane of our existence. We all have so many of them. It seems like that we have to remember that they start to use easier passwords. So yeah, indeed, if you feel like you have some of those other controls in place, where if you have things in place to stop brute force attacks, for instance, like throttling or like account lockouts, that type of thing, after a certain number of failed attempts, I think longer passwords and longer periods of time for changing them, or you may never need to change them. It kind of depends upon your appetite as a company for that risk. One thing that I do believe in are passphrases. Passphrases just inherently are going to be longer. These are typically sentences. They could be, a sentence out of a movie that's kind of your favorite movie or whatever, or just a sentence that means something to you. And if you put things in there like spaces and punctuation and the likes, those can be very strong passwords, and I think they're great to use. The question didn't ask specifically about it, but I'll also say that I'm a believer in password managers as well. Now, the only thing that I'll say about password managers is that if you're going to use a password manager, you better darn well be sure that your master password is a real strong password, because you're storing everything in there.
Okay. So the next question is, do you have any recommendations for mobile device management software?
I hesitate to make recommendations on brands. There are some things, and I'm going to put up my email address here. If this person wants to email me, I'd be glad to kind of offer some thoughts on that, but I try and be really careful with that. There's a lot of real good mobile device management systems out there, but I think I'd rather handle that one-on-one, if that's okay.
Okay. All right. The next question, when should we be requiring two-factor authentication? Are there critical risk areas that should require the two-factor? So it's like a two-part question.
Yeah. The easiest answer is everywhere you can, or everywhere that is appropriate. I mentioned in there, whenever you've got remote access, I think two-factor authentication should be a must. And when I say remote access, I mean you're outside of the walls of your organization and you're remoting in to the organization's network. So you're using either a VPN, you're using a VPN client typically of some sort, or a remote desktop type of login of some sort. Two-factor authentication should be used every time in those situations. I also am a believer that administrative access should use two-factor authentication, whether or not it is remote or on the local area network. administrative access is just so sensitive that I think it is worthwhile going through the little extra effort to put two-factor authentication on there. And there's some really good ones out there that do not cost an awful lot.
Okay. And then this is the final question we'll get to, and it's also in that same vein about the two-factor authentication. So with better two-factor options available, would you feel that the need for any complex password can disappear entirely to the point of using very simple passwords? And then it says, so as long as two-factor is strictly enforced.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you are using two-factor authentication, I'm not going to say that I think that completely negates the need for your complex passwords, but it certainly lightens the need. It lightens the importance of it. I want to be so careful on how I say that. But I hear where they're coming from. Two-factor authentication just in itself is so secure. But if you put that also with a good, strong password, you're doing everything you can. But I hear what they're saying. I think that there is an argument, and it may depend upon how sensitive is the environment you're getting access to and the appetite for risk that you might have, but certainly having the two-factor authentication there is very helpful and is going to be the more secure of the two ways of authenticating.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much, Tom. You provided us a lot of information. Not only did you give us the soup, but you provided us the salad, the crackers, and everything. But we appreciate all of the information. I did receive a lot of questions as to whether or not everyone would receive a copy of the presentations, and we will provide the slide deck as well as the recording afterwards. And I just want to thank everyone for your time today, for joining us, and we ask that you have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will, Tom's number and address and everything is here. We will make sure we provide that when we send out the presentation slides. So if you do have additional questions, we'll make sure he gets that information. Again, thank you, and on behalf of McGriff Risk Solution Services, you have a wonderful rest of your day.